Most of us are quite familiar now with the notion that certain single genes can have dramatic consequences for our health. The NHS offers a wide range of genetic tests now, upwards of 300 tests for monogenetic conditions, that is to say, diseases that are associated with single gene identification, including, for example, Huntington's disease and cystic fibrosis. These tests are only available through the NHS after they've been evaluated in a number of ways. For example, just about how accurate they are in identifying the gene, and whether the test will actually lead to an improved outcome for the patient. For DNA profiling, that looks at a range of genes involved in more complex multifactorial diseases. Profiling services are available directly to individuals through a number of companies operating from Europe and from the States, mostly of them advertised through the internet. Typically, individual clients will send a tissue sample, usually saliva, and their DNA is then analysed for either variations in the genome associated with particular diseases, or the entire genome could be sequenced. In terms of regulation, medical DNA tests are governed under EU law, but most of the tests are classed as low risk, which means that they don't require any particular regulatory approval before they're placed on the market. Moreover, the exact scope of the term medical is not entirely clear, so that for many of these kind of genetic profiling services, there's a little regulation other than that covered by advertising standards. So there's no uniform regulation or standard about what information should be given to people before they take the tests or subsequently. As the situation is now that we can go effectively down the high street to a private healthcare company for MRI or CT scan without referral from our general practitioner. So I, for example, as a man well into my 40s, shall we say, I might choose to pay for an MRI scan simply to find out how my heart's going, arriving at a certain time in my life, thinking that this is about the time to check that things actually are functioning as well as they seem to, or whether I've got early stage tumours developing that aren't currently visible or I'm not aware of them. The main technologies used here are computed tomography, CT scans, and magnetic resonance imaging, MRI scans, and these provide non-invasive images of parts of the body that would not usually be visible. In the UK, we do have a National Screening Committee that regulates this area within the public sector. And medical radiation exposure, such as you do get from CT scans, are regulated under the Act of Parliament. But there is currently no general regulatory framework applicable to the private provision of these scanning services within the private sector.
There are several possible attractions and advantages of medical profiling of these kinds. For example, in my own case, my mother died when she was about my age, and her mother, my grandmother, died in her early 30s. So I, and all those many other people like me, might have very good reasons for wanting to know what kind of genetic propensities for disease I might have inherited. And the same goes for body imaging. But against those upsides, there are some potential drawbacks about these types of medical profiling as well. For those commercial DNA tests that Hugh was referring to for multifactorial disease risks, there are questions about whether the information that comes out of the test does us any good, and even whether it might do us some harm. A recent scientific review of tests offered by 7 testing companies found that the increased disease risks that were associated with the genes they were testing for either hadn't been very satisfactorily investigated so that they could produce reliable results, or were considered to be minimal to not significant. CT tests, CT scans rather, expose us to radiation, as Hugh explained, and the MRI tests, though they don't expose us to radiation, they use magnetic technology to look at our bodies. The way that they operate at high sensitivity means that they're quite likely to throw up false positives, where the test wrongly indicates that we've got a disease problem, and then that can lead to further unnecessary investigations or even surgery that may expose us to risks from anaesthesia or acquired infections or what have you. And for both the DNA tests and the body imaging services, information that we may get from them as patients or customers may be quite hard to understand and may have the potential to give us both false reassurance and perhaps unnecessary alarm. For instance, if, like Nick Fleming, I'm told that I've got a 6% above average risk for heart disease for men of my age, how should I interpret that number? Is 6% a little or a lot? Should I be making immediate and drastic changes in my lifestyle and diet, heading to the gym immediately? Or is it sort of within the limits of measurement error? And if I do head off to my NHS GP in perplexity or alarm to ask her to help me make sense of this information and clog up her surgery waiting room, is it reasonable for me to be asking the taxpayer to pick up the costs of this follow-up activity for tests that I've chosen to buy privately without my doctor's recommendation? We're planning to look at a few selected examples of online healthcare services to think about the pros and cons of the issues they throw up. One of them is health advice, just as we can get health advice directly from doctors, from books, newspapers and magazines, write a Dear Doctor letter to those. We can also turn to websites that offer diagnoses of our ailments and may even calculate our life expectancy, just as there are various websites that offer to store our photographs or other documents. We can also store our health records on special websites, and again there are possibly real attractions in doing that. Given that many people these days take foreign holidays, and many of us have to travel widely for work, you might see advantages in having your records in that form. Some people too might think that having their medical records stored under their own control will make sure that they're not lost. But like all of these online records of a sensitive nature, the privacy of the data may be limited, and there's a risk that others who you might not want to gain access to them might do so. Then turning to purchase of drugs and other healthcare products, we understand that something like 2 million people in Britain regularly buy prescription drugs online. And there are obviously some advantages in buying drugs and other services that way. I may be able to get drugs at lower costs if I have to pay for them. I may find it more personally convenient to get drugs supplied that way. The trouble is that there are also unregulated websites that sell prescription or non-prescription medicines, and I might have trouble in telling which is which. Moreover, when I'm buying drugs that way, I'm very likely to be making my purchases across national borders, so I'm going to be cutting across all those country-specific laws and regulations that are supposed to protect us. And if I can't easily tell the regulated from the unregulated websites, I may be exposing myself to an increased risk of receiving counterfeit drugs.